Take my hand now. Mountain man found pregnant girl in forest. What happened next stunned all. A mountain man, alone for years, hears a cry in the snow-covered woods and finds a barefoot girl, heavy with child, barely breathing. He could have left her, but he didn't. Now whispers spread through town, and not all of them are kind. Fires burn, doors close, and the past she carries might set the whole valley alight. They called it rescue. But what if it was something far more dangerous? When the snow melts, who will take her hand, and who will turn their back? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The pale winter sun had barely crested the ridge when Boone Hadley pulled his worn leather gloves tighter and trudged through knee-deep snow. His breath came out in white puffs as he made his way along the trapline. The steel traps needed checking before the day grew too warm and animals grew too wary. The morning air bit sharp and clean. Boone's mule, Potter, waited patiently in a sheltered spot while his master worked. The old trapper's joints protested as he bent to check each trap, but decades in these mountains had taught him to ignore such complaints. That's when he heard it, faint as a whisper on the wind, a cry, barely there at all. Boone straightened, his weathered face creasing as he listened harder. There it came again, carried on the bitter breeze. "Hello?" he called out, voice rough from disuse. Only the wind answered, but something pulled him forward, past the next stand of spruce trees. There, crumpled in the snow like a broken bird, lay a young woman. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the mountain cold, and her bare feet had turned an alarming shade of blue. Dark hair spilled across the white ground, and when Boone knelt beside her, he saw her face was as pale as the snow itself. "Miss?" He touched her shoulder gently. No response, but she was breathing, thank the Lord, though her breaths came shallow and quick. As he shifted to lift her, he noticed the swell of her belly beneath the torn shawl. His heart clenched. She was with child, and out here alone in weather that could kill. "Gonna get you somewhere warm, miss," he murmured, though she couldn't hear. Getting her onto Potter proved a challenge. She was dead weight in his arms, and he wasn't as strong as he'd been 20 years ago. But necessity lent him strength, and soon he had her settled across the mule's back, wrapped in his own heavy coat. The 2-hour ride back to his cabin felt like the longest of his life. He kept one hand on the girl to steady her while leading Potter carefully down the snowy slope. The sun climbed higher, but brought little warmth to the winter day. His cabin appeared finally through the trees, a sturdy log structure with smoke curling from the stone chimney where he'd banked the morning fire. Boone led Potter right up to the door, then gathered the unconscious girl in his arms. Inside, he laid her gently on his narrow bed, piling every blanket he owned around her still form. The rest of the day passed in worried activity. Boone heated broth over the fire, speaking soft words of encouragement whenever he approached the bed. He'd learned long ago that even unconscious folks might hear kind words, and Lord knew this girl needed kindness. "You're safe here," he told her, as he spooned warm broth between her pale lips. "Ain't nothing gonna harm you while old Boone's around." The words felt strange in his mouth after so many years of silence, but something about her brought out a protective instinct he'd thought long buried. As sunset painted the cabin walls in deep orange, she still hadn't stirred. Boone settled into his chair by the fire, wrapped in his spare blanket, and read aloud from his worn Bible. The familiar psalms filled the quiet room as darkness gathered outside. Morning light found him dozing in the chair, jerked awake by a sudden movement from the bed. The girl's eyes were open, darting around the cabin in obvious fear. When they landed on him, she pressed herself against the wall, pulling the blankets tight around herself. "You're safe, miss," Boone said, keeping his voice gentle and staying in his chair. "Found you up on the ridge yesterday morning. Brought you here to warm up." He waited, hoping she might speak, tell him her name or what had driven her to such desperate circumstances. But she only stared, shrinking further away when he shifted in his seat. The wariness in her eyes spoke of hurts deeper than the cold, and Boone recognized the look of someone who'd learned the hard way not to trust. "I'll fix us some breakfast," he said after a while, moving slowly as he stood. "You rest easy. Ain't nobody gonna make you do anything you don't want to do." He kept his movements deliberate and calm as he stirred up the fire and set about making morning coffee, giving her space to adjust to her surroundings. Every now and then, he felt her eyes on him, watching his every move like a trapped animal looking for escape. But she was safe now, and somehow, Boone knew that helping this frightened young woman was exactly where the Lord meant him to be. The mountain cabin settled into a quiet rhythm over the next 2 days. Boone moved with careful deliberation, treating the young woman like a wild deer that might bolt at any sudden movement. He kept the fire well fed, its warmth filling the single room with a steady comfort. "You're safe here," he'd say each morning, his voice gentle as he set a cup of steaming broth near her bed. "Take your time." The girl would wait until he stepped away before reaching for the cup with trembling hands. On the second morning, Boone pulled a carefully folded quilt from his trunk. The colors had faded some, but the pattern still showed clear. Morning stars in blues and creams. His fingers lingered on the careful stitching as memories washed over him. "This here belonged to my Sarah Beth," he said softly, unfolding the quilt. "My daughter. She'd want you to have it." He draped it over the bed, pretending not to notice how the girl's fingers immediately sought out the soft fabric, or how she pulled it close when she thought he wasn't looking. Throughout those days, Boone taught her patience, how to sip the broth slowly, how to nibble small pieces of bread until her stomach grew stronger. Though she never spoke, her eyes followed him constantly. They held fear still, but something else too. A cautious assessment, as if she were trying to understand this quiet man who asked nothing of her. The third day dawned with heavy clouds that promised snow. Boone had planned to ride into Silver Crossing for help, but the weather had other ideas. By mid-morning, fat flakes swirled past the window, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. The storm settled in for a long stay, trapping them together in the cabin's warm confines. As darkness fell early that afternoon, Boone lit the oil lantern. Its gentle glow cast dancing shadows on the log walls. He settled into his chair by the fire, pulling out his worn Bible. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, the pages dog-eared at his favorite passages. "Hope you don't mind if I read some?" he said, glancing at his silent guest. "Helps pass the time during a storm." He began reading in his deep, steady voice, the familiar words of the Psalms filling the room like a comfortable blanket. When he spoke the word mercy, the girl flinched visibly. Boone paused, marking the reaction, but continued reading without comment. Some hurts needed time before they could be spoken of. Later that night, as the storm raged outside, Boone woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. Soft sobbing came from the bed, muffled, as if pressed into a pillow. He lay still on his pallet by the fire, heart aching at the pain in those quiet cries. Sometimes he knew the kindest thing was to let someone weep in privacy. Morning brought a brief respite in the storm. Pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered window as Boone stirred up the fire and set coffee to boil. The girl sat up in bed, Sarah Beth's quilt wrapped around her shoulders like armor. "Evelyn," she whispered suddenly, her voice rough from disuse. "Evelyn running, dear." Boone turned slowly, careful to keep his movement steady despite the joy that surged in his chest at hearing her speak. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she tensed, as if expecting punishment for breaking her silence. But he also saw courage there, the strength it took to trust even this small piece of herself to a stranger. He asked no questions, demanded no explanations. Instead, he crossed the room with measured steps and held out his weathered hand to her. "Take my hand now," he said softly. "We'll make it through." Evelyn stared at his offered hand for a long moment, The lantern light caught the tears in her eyes, making them shine like stars. Slowly, so slowly, she reached out and placed her smaller hand in his. The touch was light as a feather, but to Boone, it felt as solid as the mountains themselves. It was a beginning, fragile as a spring snowdrop pushing through winter ground, but a beginning all the same. The storm broke at dawn, leaving behind a world glazed in ice. Boone saddled his most sure-footed mule, knowing the treacherous paths would require extra care. He'd wrapped Evelyn warmly before leaving, making sure she had everything within reach. "I'll fetch the midwife," he'd told her, watching her eyes widen with worry. "Won't be gone more than the day. You stay inside. Keep the door latched." The trail down to Silver Crossing took twice as long as usual. Ice-coated branches crackled overhead, and the mule picked its way carefully around frozen puddles that could hide dangerous holes. By the time Boone reached the outskirts of town, the sun had climbed well past the mountains. Silver Crossing stirred with mid-morning activity. Women hurried between the general store and the post office, clutching shawls against the bitter wind. Men gathered near the smithy, their breath clouding in the cold air. Conversations died as Boone rode past, replaced by pointed stares and whispers behind gloved hands. The general store's bell jangled as Boone stepped inside. Warm air carried the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Behind the counter, old Mr. Peterson's usual friendly smile was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the shopkeeper watched Boone with narrow eyes, hands busy polishing the same spot on the counter over and over. "Morning," Boone said, removing his hat. "Need to find Miss Hazel Griggs, the midwife?" The store went quiet. A woman near the dry goods shelf hurried toward the door, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. Mr. Peterson's rag stopped moving. "Miss Griggs, you say?" The shopkeeper's voice carried clear across the store. "What business you got with her?" Before Boone could answer, the bell jangled again. Sheriff Cullen Markham filled the doorway, his badge catching the winter light. The lawman's face was hard as he gestured Boone outside. "A word, Hadley." The cold bit deeper as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Markham planted himself square in Boone's path, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Word travels fast in these parts," the sheriff said. "Even up to your mountain, we know about the girl." Boone kept his voice steady. "She needs help." "No decent woman will help a runaway half-breed girl?" Markham spat the words like they tasted bitter, especially not one in her condition. "You'd do better to forget about it. She'll die without help." Boone felt anger rising in his chest, but kept it contained. That what passes for Christian charity these days? "You watch yourself, Hadley." Markham's hand drifted toward his gun. "Some folks might take offense at you harboring such as her." Movement caught Boone's eye. Matthew Roan, the preacher's son, was hurrying past on the other side of the muddy street. The young man's face was pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if afraid to look anywhere else. When Boone called out his name, Matthew quickened his pace, disappearing around the corner of the church. Boone spent another hour trying to find someone willing to help. Each door closed in his face. Each person turned away. By mid-afternoon, with the sun already sliding toward the mountains, he knew he had to head back. The return journey seemed longer, darker. Shadows stretched across the trail, and every snapping twig made him think of riders following. It was full dark by the time he reached the cabin. Evelyn met him at the door, her face tight with fear. She'd pushed his old rocking chair against the wall, where she could watch both windows at once. The quilt was wrapped tight around her shoulders. "They came," she whispered as he built up the fire. "3 riders circled the cabin twice. Didn't come close, but—" Her voice trailed off. Boone checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "Did you recognize any of them?" She nodded, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly. The preacher's son, Matthew. Tears filled her eyes. "He's the father. But his pa, the reverend, he said I was lying, Said I was trying to trap his boy with my... She couldn't finish. Boone moved slowly to her side, careful not to startle her. No one's going to harm you here. I give you my word on that. But as he stoked the fire and set coffee to boil, he wondered how he could keep that promise. The town's hatred cast long shadows, and they'd already reached up the mountain to his door. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Boone pulled on his heavy coat. The woodpile had dwindled during the storm, and the bitter cold showed no signs of letting up. Evelyn sat wrapped in quilts near the fire, watching him with eyes that seemed less frightened than the day before. "Won't be far," he said, shouldering his axe. "Just down to the timber stand below the cabin. Holler if you need anything." She nodded, pulling the quilts tighter. Boone noticed how she'd arranged the rocking chair to face both the door and windows, ready to spot any approaching riders. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk. In the crystal-clear morning air, his boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way down to where young pines grew thick enough for good firewood. Inside the cabin, Evelyn waited until Boone's footsteps faded before slowly rising from her chair. Her legs felt stronger today, though her back ached something fierce. She moved carefully around the small space, touching rough-hewn furniture that spoke of patient hands. A shelf above the washstand held a few books. Her fingers traced their spines until they found a small leather Bible, its corners worn smooth. When she opened it, a girl's name was written in careful script: Sarah Beth Hadley, Boone's daughter. Evelyn wondered what had happened to her, why she wasn't here anymore. Near the workbench, she discovered wooden shavings and carving tools laid out neat as church silver. Some finished pieces sat on a shelf: a delicate bird, a leaping fish, a bear standing tall. Each one showed the same careful attention she'd seen in how Boone tended his cabin and treated her. The door's hinges creaked. Evelyn startled, but it was just Boone returning with an armload of split wood. He paused when he saw her standing by his workbench, but said nothing as he stacked the logs by the hearth. She'd started humming without realizing it, an old song her mother used to sing, about snow falling soft as eagle feathers and carrying dreams to sleeping children. The familiar melody steadied her heart as she watched flames dance in the fireplace. "That's pretty," Boone said quietly, settling into his chair. "Your mama's song?" Evelyn nodded. "She taught me all the old songs before she passed, said they'd keep me company when times got hard." She swallowed hard, then added, "Times surely got hard." "Reckon they did." Boone's voice was gentle. "Might help to speak of it, if you've a mind to." The fire popped and hissed as Evelyn gathered her courage. "Matthew, he said he loved me. Said none of it mattered. Not my being half Cheyenne. Not what folks would say." Her hand rested on her swollen belly. "When I told him about the baby, he got scared. Went running to his pa." Boone waited, patient as winter. "Reverend Roan, Evelyn's voice caught. "He said I was trying to trap his son, called me terrible names, said no son of his would marry a..." She couldn't repeat the words. "They drove me out of town that very night. Matthew wouldn't even look at me." Tears slid down her cheeks. Boone handed her his handkerchief without comment or judgment, just quiet understanding in his weathered face. As evening settled in, Boone lit the lamp and pulled a rough plank of pine from beneath his workbench. Evelyn watched as he chose a carving tool and began working the wood with sure, steady strokes. "What are you making?" she asked after a while. "Nameplate," he replied, carefully shaping each letter. "For the little one." Evelyn leaned closer, watching as the word took shape beneath his knife. M-E-R-C-Y. "My Sarah Beth had one just like it," Boone said softly. "Seemed right to make one for your child, too?" Fresh tears spilled, but these were different from before. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, "for everything." Outside, snow began falling again. Big, lazy flakes, that drifted past the windows and settled thick on the ground. By morning, the forest roads would be sealed tight, leaving them alone in their small circle of warmth and growing trust. Boone kept carving as darkness gathered, his knife steady and sure. Evelyn hummed her mother's lullaby, one hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked gentle as butterfly wings. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the nameplate where Mercy stood out clear and strong against the pine. 2 days passed like molasses in winter. The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when Boone saddled his mule for another trip into Silver Crossing. This time, he carried determination as heavy as the coins in his pocket, his last season's trapping money. The town stirred with early activity as he rode in. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the general store's bell chimed as he tied his mule to the hitching post. A few townsfolk hurried past, their eyes down, pretending not to see him. Inside the store, Boone selected thick wool blankets and yards of soft cotton cloth. The shopkeeper's wife watched him with curious eyes as he laid out his purchases. "Mighty lot of cloth for a mountain man," she remarked, measuring out the fabric. Boone said nothing, counting out his coins. Half his savings disappeared into the till, but he didn't flinch. The midwife's house sat at the edge of town, its whitewashed fence neat despite peeling paint. Boone knocked 3 times. The door opened to reveal Miss Hazel Griggs, her gray hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet, her eyes sharp but kind. "Wondered when you'd come calling again," she said, studying him. "That girl needs help, doesn't she?" "Yes'm," Boone replied. "Due soon, I reckon." Hazel glanced up and down the street. "Wait here." She disappeared inside, returning with a worn leather bag. "My brother Daniel will bring me out after sunset. Less eyes that way." Relief softened Boone's weathered face. "Much obliged, Miss Hazel." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Just doing what's right." The sun had dipped behind the mountains when Boone heard wagon wheels approaching his cabin. Evelyn tensed by the fire, but Boone touched her shoulder gently. "It's all right. Help's coming." Daniel Griggs's wagon rattled to a stop. Hazel climbed down, medical bag in hand, and followed Boone inside. The cabin glowed with lamplight as Evelyn stood uncertainly, one hand protective over her belly. "Well now," Hazel said warmly, setting down her bag. "Let's have a proper look at you, dear." Evelyn's eyes widened at the kindness in Hazel's voice. The midwife moved forward slowly, like approaching a spooked fawn. "I know what it's like," Hazel said softly, "carrying a child alone, feeling the whole world's turned its back." She sat in the rocking chair, patting the stool beside her. "Had my James 30 years ago, before I married. People have long memories, but shorter hearts sometimes." Evelyn sank onto the stool, tears welling. "What happened?" "Life happened, dear. My boy grew strong. My husband loved him like his own, and those who judged found other things to fret about." Hazel squeezed Evelyn's hand. "Your baby will have love too. I can see that plain as day." Boone busied himself by the fire, giving the women space as they talked. Hazel showed Evelyn how to prepare for the birth, checking her belly with gentle hands and nodding with satisfaction. "Strong heartbeat," she declared. "We'll need clean linens, plenty of hot water when the time comes. I'll be here. Don't you fret about that." Over the next few days, strange things began happening. A basket of fresh eggs appeared by Boone's fence, jars of preserved fruit, a stack of clean quilts, even a tiny knitted cap, all left under cover of darkness by unseen hands. "Seems some folks got conscience after all," Boone remarked one evening, bringing in another anonymous gift. Evelyn touched the soft cap, hope blooming in her chest. Maybe they remember what Miss Hazel said about shorter hearts. That night after supper, Boone opened his Bible as usual. The lamplight cast warm shadows as he read from the Psalms, his deep voice steady and sure. Evelyn listened, one hand resting on her belly, the other reaching across the space between them to grasp Boone's weathered fingers. He paused in his reading, surprised by the touch. Evelyn squeezed his hand once, gentle but firm, like sealing a promise. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The fire crackled, wind whispered through pine boughs, and in that moment, the cabin felt more like home than either had known in a long, long time. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at Boone's cabin. Each morning, frost painted delicate patterns on the window panes, and smoke curled from the chimney into the crisp mountain air. Inside, the cabin hummed with quiet purpose. Hazel's wagon arrived like clockwork each afternoon, her medical bag swinging from her arm as she climbed down. She'd check Evelyn's progress, nodding with satisfaction at the baby's strong movements. "That little one's got spirit," she'd say, pressing her hands against Evelyn's growing belly, dancing like a spring fawn in there. In the workshop corner, wood shavings piled around Boone's boots as he worked. The pine cradle took shape beneath his careful hands. First the sturdy rockers, then the curved headboard, each piece sanded smooth as silk. He'd learned woodworking during quieter seasons, but this project stirred something deeper. Evelyn watched him work while she stirred the cooking pot or mended clothes. One afternoon, she approached the nearly finished cradle, touching its golden wood with reverent fingers. "May I add something?" she asked softly. Boone nodded, wiping his hands on his shirt. Evelyn retrieved a small pouch from her belongings and mixed earth pigments with water. With delicate strokes, she painted symbols along the cradle's edges: morning stars, running horses, medicine wheels. Each mark held meaning from her mother's people. "This one means protection," she explained, adding a curved line. "And this," she touched another symbol, "means belonging." Boone watched her work, respect deepening in his eyes. "Your mama taught you these?" "Yes," she said, "our stories live in these marks." Evelyn's voice grew soft with memory. "Even when the people are gone, the stories remain." Their days fell into partnership. Evelyn learned to stretch their provisions, turning tough venison into savory stew with wild herbs. Boone showed her how to check the snare lines, teaching her to read tracks in the snow and spot the subtle signs of game. "Watch how the branches bend," he'd say, pointing to a rabbit's passage. "Nature speaks if you learn to listen." One bitter evening, while Evelyn rested, Boone rode into town for supplies. Near the saloon, he overhead raised voices. Matthew Roan, the preacher's son, swayed on unsteady feet as Hazel gripped his arm. "You can't hide from truth forever." Hazel's voice cut sharp through the darkness. "That girl carries your child." Matthew's face crumpled. "I know. God help me, I know." He slumped against the wall, whiskey thick on his breath. "But Father, he'd sooner see me dead than admit his only son." He choked on the words. "Your father's pride ain't worth that baby's future," Hazel pressed. "Do right by them, Matthew, before it's too late." Boone slipped away, leaving them to their reckoning. But the encounter stirred old wounds. That night, sleep eluded him. When it finally came, his dreams were filled with another girl's face, his daughter, Sarah, lost to him through his own stubborn pride. He saw her as she'd been at 17, wild-hearted and desperate to forge her own path. He'd tried to fence her in with rules and judgment until one day she'd ridden away. 10 years gone now. He woke with tears on his cheeks, the dream's echo still raw in his chest. A soft touch on his shoulder made him start. Evelyn stood there, concern in her dark eyes. She'd heard his restless movements and brought him a cup of water. Bad dreams? Boone accepted the cup, his hands trembling slightly. Old memories, my girl, Sarah, I failed her. Evelyn settled carefully beside him. "Tell me?" The story spilled out like water from a broken dam. His rigid rules, Sarah's rebellion, the final argument that drove her away. "Haven't seen her since. Don't even know if she's alive." "You loved her," Evelyn said simply. "Love can learn new ways." Boone looked at her then. really looked at this young woman who'd brought such unexpected grace to his solitary life. She'd taught him as much about mercy as he'd ever learned from Scripture. "Reckon you're right about that," he said softly. The baby chose that moment to kick, strong enough for both to see the movement. Evelyn laughed, taking Boone's weathered hand and pressing it to the spot. Another kick, like a greeting. "See?" she smiled. "New life brings new chances." Dawn was breaking over the ridge, painting the snow-covered peaks in rose and gold. In the quiet cabin, something shifted and settled, like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper place. They weren't bound by blood, this unlikely pair, but family had found them all the same. Christmas Eve morning broke over the mountains like splintered crystal, sharp and brilliant against fresh snow. Inside Boone's cabin, Evelyn stirred restlessly on her bed, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. "Boone," she called out, her voice tight with pain. I think it's time." Boone looked up from stoking the fire, saw the tension in her face, and was on his feet in an instant. He'd been ready for this moment, his coat and boots waiting by the door. "Hold fast," he said, pulling on his winter gear. "I'll fetch Hazel straight away." The ride into town was brutal against the winter wind, but Boone pressed his horse hard through the drifts. When he reached Hazel's door, she was already awake, as if expecting him. "The baby's coming," was all he needed to say. Hazel nodded briskly. "Martha, Sarah," she called over her shoulder to two women drinking coffee in her kitchen. "Grab those birthing supplies we prepared. We're needed." The three women loaded quickly into Hazel's wagon, wrapped in heavy quilts against the cold. Boone led them back along the snowy trail, his heart keeping time with his horse's hooves. When they arrived, Evelyn was pacing the cabin floor, pausing every few minutes to breathe through her contractions. Hazel took charge immediately, directing Martha and Sarah to help transform the cabin's main room into a birthing space. "Clear that table," Hazel instructed. "Sarah, get water boiling. Martha, lay out the clean linens." The women moved with practiced efficiency, their skirts swishing as they worked. They hung fresh sheets for privacy, laid down clean straw, and arranged their supplies with quiet purpose. Evelyn gripped Boone's hand during a particularly sharp pain. "Don't leave," she whispered. "I'll be right outside," he promised, squeezing her fingers gently. "Got some prayers to say anyhow?" The hours crawled by like molasses in winter. Boone paced the porch, wearing a path in the snow. Inside, he could hear the women's encouraging voices mixed with Evelyn's labor pains. Every now and then, Hazel would call out a prayer, and the others would answer with fervent amens. The sun climbed to its peak and began its descent. The shadows grew long across the snow. Still, the women worked, and Evelyn labored. Finally, as the first stars began to appear in the eastern sky, a new sound pierced the winter quiet, the sharp, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Boone's head snapped up at the sound. His heart seemed to stop, then restart with a mighty thump. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared at the door, her face glowing. "Come meet your granddaughter," she said softly. Inside, Evelyn lay propped up on clean pillows, her face tired but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in one of Boone's daughter's old blankets, lay a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair. "She's perfect," Hazel announced, beaming with pride. "Strong lungs, good color, 10 fingers, and 10 toes." Boone approached carefully, almost reverently. Evelyn looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Would you like to hold her?" His hands trembled as he took the tiny bundle. The baby girl blinked up at him with dark eyes, and something in his chest cracked wide open. "Mercy," he whispered, remembering the nameplate he'd carved. "Welcome to the world, little one." While Martha and Sarah cleaned up, Boone retrieved the wooden nameplate he'd been saving. With careful movements, he mounted it above the pine cradle, the word "Mercy" gleaming in the lamplight. The women had brought supplies for a proper Christmas Eve celebration. As evening settled in, they heated spiced cider on the stove, its sweet aroma mixing with the pine boughs they'd hung around the cabin. "Silent Night," Martha began singing softly, and the others joined in. Their voices blended in the warm air as snow began falling again outside, each flake catching the lamplight like a tiny star. Boone sat beside Evelyn's bed, watching her cradle little Mercy. The baby had nursed and now slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled against her mother's chest. In the gentle light, they looked like one of those holy paintings he'd seen in church long ago, mother and child, peaceful and blessed. The carol faded into reverent silence. Through the window, Boone could see the snow falling thicker now, but inside, all was warm and bright. He looked at his unlikely family, Evelyn, baby Mercy, even Hazel and her friends who'd chosen kindness over judgment, and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Mercy slept on, safe and loved on her first Christmas Eve, while outside the snow continued to fall, covering the world in fresh, clean white. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow glittering like diamond dust in the early light. Inside Boone's cabin, Evelyn sat propped up in bed. Little Mercy nestled against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket while she slept. Boone had just finished stoking the fire when he heard the first crunch of footsteps in the snow. He moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but what he saw made him pause. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, was making her way up the path, carrying a cloth-covered basket. Behind her, more figures emerged from the tree line, familiar faces from town, each bearing gifts. "Looks like we've got company," Boone said softly to Evelyn. She pulled Mercy closer, uncertain, but Boone gave her a reassuring nod. He opened the door as Sarah reached the porch. "Merry Christmas," she said, pulling back the cloth to reveal fresh baked bread, still warm from the oven. "We thought the new mama might need some proper food." One by one, the townspeople approached. Mrs. Thompson brought a stack of carefully knitted blankets. The Cooper sisters arrived with a basket of preserved fruits. Old Tom Wheeler, who rarely spoke to anyone, shuffled forward with a hand-carved wooden cross. Young Jimmy Blake, no more than 10 years old, stepped up to Evelyn's bedside with shy determination. In his mittened hands, he held a simple wooden rattle. "Made it myself," he mumbled, holding it out. "For the baby." Evelyn's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the gift. "Thank you, Jimmy. Would you like to see her?" The boy nodded, and Evelyn tilted Mercy so he could see her sleeping face. "She's real pretty," he whispered, then scampered back to his mother's side. The cabin filled with quiet chatter and the rustle of wrapping paper as more gifts were presented. The air grew warm with bodies and goodwill, the smell of fresh bread mixing with pine boughs and wood smoke. As dusk approached, the gathering grew quiet at the sound of hoofbeats outside. Through the window, they saw Matthew Roan dismounting from his horse. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale and drawn. Boone met him at the door. Matthew's boots dragged through the snow as he made his way to the porch. Without a word, he fell to his knees. "I can't bear it anymore," he choked out, tears freezing on his cheeks. "The shame of what I've done." The gathered townspeople moved closer, forming a circle around the porch. Evelyn sat up straighter in her bed. Mercy held close. "I'm the father of Evelyn's child," Matthew confessed, his voice carrying in the winter stillness. "I took advantage of her trust, then let my father cast her out when she needed help the most." He looked up at Boone, then at Evelyn. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Thompson clicked her tongue. Old Tom Wheeler spat in the snow. Sarah Miller crossed her arms, her face dark with disapproval. Not at Evelyn now, but at Matthew. "Word will spread fast," Boone said quietly to Evelyn as Matthew continued to weep on the porch. "But not all hearts change overnight." As if to prove his point, an angry shout echoed from the direction of town. Reverend Roan had heard the news. His voice carried up the valley, calling for his son. "You'd best go face your father," Boone told Matthew, "but know this. That baby girl in there deserves a father who'll stand up for her, not run away when things get hard." Matthew nodded, stumbling to his feet. The townspeople parted to let him pass, their faces a mix of pity and judgment. As darkness settled over the mountain, most of the visitors made their way home. Boone prepared a simple stew from the supplies they'd been given, and he and Evelyn ate together by lamplight. Mercy slept peacefully in her new cradle, the word mercy gleaming above her head. From the valley below, church bells began to ring, their clear tones floating up through the winter air. Evelyn hummed along softly, a Christmas hymn her mother had taught her long ago. "Listen," she whispered to Mercy, "those bells are ringing for you too." The days following Christmas brought a gentle peace to Boone's cabin. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals, coating the mountain in fresh white. Inside, the cabin was warm with new life and quiet contentment. On the second morning, Boone rose before dawn, checking his trap lines as the sky turned from black to purple to pink. His boots crunched through fresh powder as he made his rounds. Near the creek, he found 2 plump rabbits in his snares. A steel trap had caught a young deer, enough meat to see them through the week ahead. He worked quickly, using his hunting knife with practiced skill. The cold air burned his lungs as he hauled the dressed meat back to the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the window he could see Evelyn rocking Mercy by the fire. Inside, Hazel Griggs sat at the rough-hewn table, her medical bag open beside her. She visited daily now, teaching Evelyn the ways of motherhood with gentle patience. "Like this," Hazel demonstrated, showing Evelyn how to wrap Mercy snugly in a blanket. "Babies feel safer when they're swaddled tight. Reminds them of being in the womb." Evelyn's fingers moved carefully, mimicking Hazel's motions. Mercy cooed softly as the blanket enveloped her. "You're a natural?" Hazel smiled, watching Evelyn cradle the baby to nurse. "You know, I've been thinking." She paused, looking between Boone and Evelyn. "This cabin of yours, it's sturdy. With some work, it could shelter more than just 3 people." Boone looked up from where he was cleaning his knife. "What are you getting at, Hazel?" "There are other girls out there like Evelyn was. Scared, alone, nowhere to turn." Hazel's eyes grew distant. "I see them sometimes, passing through town. They need a safe place." Evelyn's eyes brightened. "We could help them?" "It's just a thought," Hazel said quickly. "But with your skills, Boone, and my medical knowledge..." The conversation lingered in the air like wood smoke, full of possibility. But fate had other plans. On the 4th morning, Boone stepped onto his porch and spotted an unusual column of smoke rising from the edge of his property. His jaw tightened as he grabbed his rifle and headed toward it. The smoke led him to his fence line. Someone had built a small fire there, letting it burn dangerously close to his wooden posts. Nailed to one post was a piece of paper, its edges charred. Boone pulled it free, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he read the crude message. "Harboring sinners makes you one. God's judgment comes swift." At the bottom was a single cross drawn in thick black ink. Boone's throat went dry. He knew who had left it. Only one man in Silver Crossing would sign with a cross. He crumpled the paper and stamped out the remains of the fire, his mind already racing with plans to protect his newfound family. That night, after Evelyn had nursed Mercy and laid her in the cradle, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "Boone?" "I hear it," he said softly, already moving to the door with his rifle. "Stay inside. Keep Mercy quiet if you can." He positioned himself in the shadows of the porch, his rifle ready but not raised. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. Somewhere in the darkness, branches cracked under heavy boots. Inside, Mercy began to cry. Evelyn hurried to the cradle, humming softly, trying to quiet her daughter. But the baby's wails pierced the night air, echoing off the snow-covered ground. Boone remained motionless, watching the tree line. The moon cast long shadows through the bare branches, and somewhere an owl called, once, twice, then silence. The night stretched on, broken only by Mercy's occasional whimpers and the soft creak of Boone's boots as he shifted his weight. Minutes stretched into hours. The temperature dropped, frosting Boone's beard, but still he waited. Whatever threat lurked in the darkness, he would meet it head-on. He had failed to protect his own daughter years ago. He would not fail Evelyn and Mercy now. Finally, as the moon reached its peak, the sound of hoofbeats returned, this time moving away. But Boone didn't relax his vigilance. He knew this was only the beginning. The preacher's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride could be more dangerous than any wild animal Boone had ever faced in these mountains. Inside, Evelyn finally got Mercy to sleep. She moved to the window, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "Will they be back?" she whispered. Boone didn't answer immediately. He was still watching the tree line, his rifle ready. Some questions didn't need answers. They both knew the truth. The peace of Christmas had been short-lived and darker days lay ahead. Dawn painted the sky in shades of iron gray as Boone saddled his horse. The fresh snow crunched beneath the animals' hooves as they made their way down the mountain trail towards Silver Crossing. His jaw was set firm, the threatening note from yesterday folded in his coat pocket. The town was just stirring to life when he arrived. Smoke rose from chimneys, and a few early risers hurried through the cold morning air. Boone tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Sheriff Cullen Markham sat behind his desk, warming his hands on a tin cup of coffee. He barely glanced up as Boone approached. "Someone's making threats," Boone said, laying the charred paper on the desk. "Left a fire burning near my fence line, too?" The sheriff picked up the note, studied it with disinterest. "Lot of crosses in this town, Hadley. Could be anyone's mark." "You know exactly whose mark that is?" Cullen shrugged, sliding the paper back. "Can't arrest a man for drawing a cross, unless you got proof of something more?" Boone's fingers curled into fists. "That girl and her baby need protection." "Should have thought about that before you took in trouble." Cullen sipped his coffee. "Way I see it, you brought this on yourself." Anger burning in his chest, Boone left the sheriff's office and walked the short distance to the white-painted church. The morning sun had barely cleared the steeple when the preacher emerged, wrapped in a thick black coat. "Come to confess your sins, Hadley." The preacher's voice dripped with contempt. "Come to warn you," Boone said quietly. "Leave my family be." The preacher's face reddened. "Family? That girl is a stain on the Lord's robe. Her bastard child?" Boone's fist connected with the preacher's jaw before he could finish. The man sprawled backward into the snow, blood trickling from his lip. Women gathering for morning prayer screamed. The preacher scrambled up, pointing a shaking finger. "The Lord will cast you out, both of you!" By noon, word of the fight had spread through every corner of Silver Crossing. Boone rode home fast, knowing trouble would follow. Evelyn met him at the door, Mercy bundled against her chest. "I heard riders earlier," she said, fear in her eyes. Boone spent the afternoon moving supplies to the root cellar, food, blankets, water, just in case. As dusk settled, he posted himself on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The first stars were just appearing when he saw the torches. They came from 3 directions, a dozen riders at least. The first burning bottle crashed through the barn window before Boone could shout a warning. "Evelyn!" he called, rushing inside. "Take Mercy to the root cellar, now!" She grabbed the baby and ran as flames began to consume the barn. The dry hay caught quick, sending sparks into the night sky. Boone grabbed buckets, racing between the well and the barn, trying to save what he could. He was so focused on fighting the fire that he didn't hear the riders approach. Rough hands grabbed him from behind. He turned to see Sheriff Markham and 2 deputies. "Boone Hadley," the sheriff said, producing iron handcuffs, "you're under arrest for violence against a man of God." "My barn's burning," Boone struggled against their grip. "Should have thought about that before you struck a preacher." The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. From the corner of his eye, Boone saw Evelyn emerge from the root cellar. Their eyes met across the firelit yard. He gave a slight shake of his head. "Stay hidden." She understood. Clutching Mercy tight, she melted back into the shadows of the trees. Snow was starting to fall again as the deputies forced Boone onto a horse. The last thing he saw as they rode away was Evelyn's small figure disappearing into the dark forest, just as she had appeared to him that first morning. But this time, she carried precious cargo. A baby girl named Mercy, born of love and hope, now fleeing into the wilderness. The barn collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks, lighting the snow-filled sky like fallen stars. Evelyn pressed Mercy closer to her chest, sheltering the infant from the biting wind. Snow dusted their shoulders as they pushed deeper into the pine forest. Her legs trembled with each step, still weak from childbirth just days ago. The familiar burning ache reminded her how fresh her ordeal had been. Mercy's thin wail pierced the winter air. Evelyn ducked beneath a snow-laden branch and began to sing softly in Cheyenne, the words her mother had taught her rising like smoke. "Little dove, rest your wings. Mother Earth holds you close. Father Sky watches high. Sleep now, precious one." The ancient words seemed to calm Mercy, whose cries softened to whimpers. Evelyn's throat tightened as she thought of her own mother singing these same verses. She forced herself to keep moving, though her feet felt like lead. The weak winter sun was sinking fast. Evelyn knew she needed shelter before full dark. Her eyes scanned the rocky hillside, remembering Boone's lessons about survival. There, a dark shadow beneath an overhanging ledge of rock. She made her way carefully toward it, testing each step in the deep snow. The overhang created a shallow cave, just deep enough to shelter from the wind. Evelyn cleared away loose stones with her feet, then eased down to sit with her back against the rock wall. She unwrapped her shawl and checked Mercy. The baby's cheeks were red from cold, but she was warm enough against her mother's body. "Now we make fire, little one," Evelyn whispered. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the flint Boone had given her during their lessons. Her hands shook as she gathered dry pine needles and small twigs, arranging them just as he had shown her. Strike after strike. The flint sparked but didn't catch. Evelyn's fingers grew numb. Mercy began to fuss again. "Please," she whispered to whatever spirits might be listening. The next strike sent sparks into the pine needles, and a tiny flame took hold. Miles away in Silver Crossing's jail, Boone sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. The cell door creaked open, and Hazel Griggs stepped in, carrying a covered basket. "Brought you some bread and meat," she said quietly, setting it beside him. "And news." Boone looked up sharply. "Evelyn? No sign yet." Hazel's face was drawn with worry. "The snow's covering any tracks. Sheriff's men are watching the roads, but I don't think she'd take those anyway." "She's smart," Boone said. "She'll remember what I taught her about survival." He gripped the iron bars. "Hazel, you have to help them. That baby's too young for this cold." Hazel nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "I've been thinking, there's someone who might help, someone who knows these mountains better than any of us." "Chief Toma," Boone said immediately. "The Arapaho winter camp is 3 hours' ride north. He'd help. We fought together in the war." "I'll go tonight," Hazel said firmly. "The moon's bright enough." Boone reached through the bars and caught her hand. "Thank you, Hazel. Tell him it's time to repay that debt from Medicine Bow." As soon as darkness fell, Hazel saddled her strongest horse and rode north. The moon cast blue shadows on the snow as she followed the winding trail toward the Arapaho camp. Her brother's old army coat kept her warm, but fear for Evelyn and the baby drove her faster than comfort allowed. She reached the winter camp well after midnight. Two braves met her at the edge of the circle of lodges, their faces stern but not hostile. "I seek Chief Toma," she said clearly. "I bring word from Boone Hadley." The name opened doors. Minutes later, she sat in Toma's lodge, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. The chief listened without interruption as she explained about Evelyn, the baby, and Boone's arrest. When she finished, Toma was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice deep and certain. "Boone Hadley saved my life at Medicine Bow. Now his family needs saving." He rose and spoke rapidly in Arapaho to the two braves who had escorted Hazel. They nodded and left the lodge immediately. "We ride now," Toma told Hazel. "The girl is Cheyenne. She will know how to survive until we find her." "But the baby," he shook his head. "The baby needs warmth." Within minutes, 3 riders emerged from the camp into the moonlit night. Toma led the way, reading signs in the snow that Hazel couldn't see. They rode toward the high country where Evelyn had first appeared to Boone, following the ancient paths that had guided people through these mountains for generations. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when Chief Toma raised his hand, signaling his braves to halt. His keen eyes had caught sight of thin smoke rising through the pines. He dismounted silently, motioning for the others to wait, and moved forward on foot through the deep snow. The smoke led him to a rocky overhang where a small fire flickered weakly. There, huddled against the stone, sat Evelyn. Her eyes were closed, her face pale as the snow around her. Little Mercy was clutched tight against her chest, wrapped in layers of cloth. Both were still, too still. "Daughter," Toma called softly in Cheyenne, not wanting to startle her. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, glazed with exhaustion. Her cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. Toma knelt beside her, noting the blue tinge to her fingers where they gripped the baby. Mercy stirred weakly, making tiny sounds of distress. "I am friend to Boone Hadley," Toma said, slowly unwrapping a thick buffalo robe from his shoulders. "We come to take you home." Tears froze on Evelyn's cheeks as she nodded, too weak to resist when Toma gently wrapped both mother and child in the warm fur. He lifted them carefully, cradling them against his chest, and carried them back to where the horses waited. "The child first," he commanded his braves. They fashioned a secure nest of furs across his saddle, where Mercy could ride protected from the wind. Evelyn they settled behind him, supported by one of the braves who mounted up behind her. The sun was fully risen by the time they reached Boone's cabin. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Hazel had arrived ahead of them and prepared for their return. She threw open the door as they approached, her face lined with worry. "Bring them straight to the fire," she directed, already pulling blankets from the bed. They settled Evelyn in Boone's old chair, closest to the hearth's warmth. Her fingers and toes were badly frostbitten, but she was conscious enough now to hold Mercy while Hazel examined the baby. "Thank the Lord," Hazel breathed, finding Mercy's skin warm and her cry strong. "You kept her alive, child. You did so well." In town, Sheriff Markham stood at his office window watching a crowd gather outside the church. The preacher's Sunday sermon had turned into a shouting match when Matthew Roan stood up and publicly confessed everything. His sin with Evelyn, his father's cruel rejection of her, the threats that drove her away. The sheriff wasn't a foolish man. He could see which way the wind was blowing as longtime church members walked out in disgust at their preacher's actions. Even his own deputy's wife had sharp words about unchristian behavior toward an innocent girl and her baby. With a heavy sigh, Markham took his ring of keys and walked to the jail cell where Boone sat waiting. "Reckon I've got no cause to hold you?" he said gruffly, turning the lock. That preacher threw the first punch, by most accounts. Boone stood slowly, favoring his right leg, where he'd been kicked during the arrest. His eyes were hard as he looked at Markham. "You knew all along what was right." The sheriff couldn't meet his gaze. "Sometimes doing right ain't as simple as it should be." "It's always simple," Boone said quietly. "We just make it hard." He limped out of the jail into the cold afternoon sun. His cabin was a good hour's walk, but he'd make it by sunset. Each step was a prayer that Evelyn and Mercy were safe, that Hazel and Toma had found them in time. The sun was touching the western peaks when Boone finally came around the last bend in the trail. Light glowed in his cabin windows, and smoke rose straight and strong from the chimney. His heart clenched at the sight. He pushed open the door with trembling hands. There, in his old chair by the fire, sat Evelyn. She was wrapped in furs, her feet soaking in a basin of warm water, but her eyes were clear and bright. In her arms, Mercy slept peacefully, tiny fingers curled around the edge of a buffalo robe. "Welcome home," Evelyn whispered. Boone's legs gave way. He dropped to his knees beside the chair, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. His hand shook as he reached out to touch Mercy's soft cheek, then Evelyn's arm, assuring himself they were real. "I thought I'd lost you both," he choked out. "Chief Toma found us," Evelyn said softly. "He said you saved his life once. And now he saved my heart twice over?" Boone looked up to where Toma stood quietly in the corner. The two men's eyes met in silent understanding. A debt paid, a circle completed. Hazel stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on Boone's shoulder. "They'll be just fine," she assured him. "Nothing that rest and warmth won't heal." The fire crackled warmly, casting its glow over them all. The unlikely family brought together by mercy and bound now by love stronger than blood. Outside, snow began to fall softly in the gathering dusk, but inside Boone's cabin, all was warm and whole and right. Snow dusted the wooden steps of Silver Crossing's white-painted church that Sunday morning. Townspeople filed in quietly, stamping their boots and nodding to neighbors. The usual buzz of conversation was muted, heavy with expectation. Everyone had heard about Matthew Roan's public confession, about Evelyn and the baby, about Boone's arrest and release. Evelyn sat in the back pew beside Boone, little Mercy bundled warmly against her chest. Hazel Griggs had insisted on accompanying them, positioning herself protectively on Evelyn's other side. A few heads turned and whispers rustled through the congregation, but no one dared say anything unkind under Hazel's stern gaze. The church bell tolled 9 times, its sound clear and sharp in the winter air. Reverend Roan emerged from his study, but instead of taking his usual place at the pulpit, he stood before the altar. His face was drawn, his shoulders bent as if carrying a great weight. "My friends," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "for 23 years, I have stood in this pulpit and preached about God's mercy." He paused, swallowing hard. "But when that mercy was needed most, I failed to show it. I let pride and fear of scandal overcome Christian charity." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Matthew Roan rose from his seat in the front pew, moving to stand beside his father. "I drove away a young woman in desperate need," the Reverend continued. "I chose to protect my reputation rather than protect a soul in my care. In doing so, I betrayed not only my calling, but the very teachings of Christ." His hands gripped the altar rail. "I cannot continue to serve as your minister. I hereby resign my position." Gasps echoed through the church. The Reverend stepped back, head bowed, and walked slowly toward the side door. But before he could leave, Evelyn's clear voice rang out, "I forgive you." The Reverend stopped, trembling. He turned to face her, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Evelyn stood, Mercy cradled in her arms, her face gentle but strong. "If I've learned anything from Boone and Miss Hazel," she said softly, "it's that mercy goes both ways." Matthew Roan cleared his throat and stepped up to the pulpit his father had vacated. His hands shook as he gripped the wooden edges. "My father isn't the only one who needs forgiveness," he said. "I was a coward. I let Evelyn face shame and danger alone rather than stand up and claim my responsibility." He looked out over the congregation. "But God has given us a chance to make things right, not just for Evelyn and Mercy, but for others who might need help." He straightened his shoulders. "I propose we build a home, a place of refuge for unwed mothers and anyone else who's been turned away with nowhere to go. A place where they can find the mercy we failed to show before." From the back of the church, Boone's deep voice carried clearly, "No soul is beyond saving if someone will take their hand." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then old Mrs. Peterson, who had lost her own daughter in similar circumstances years ago, began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the church with its thunder. Hazel Griggs stood up, her face bright with purpose. "I'll oversee the home," she announced. "I've got the medical knowledge, and I reckon I understand better than most what these girls will need." "I'll donate the lumber," called out Mr. Jensen, the mill owner. "My wife and I can offer 2 acres of land just outside town," added Farmer Thompson. The offers kept coming. Blankets, furniture, food, labor. Even Sheriff Markham stood to pledge his support and protection for the future residents. The Reverend, who had paused by the door, turned back one last time. "Matthew," he said, his voice breaking, "you're a better man than I ever was. Miss Evelyn, I hope someday you can truly forgive an old fool who forgot that God's love knows no boundaries." Evelyn walked forward, Mercy still nestled against her chest. She took the Reverend's hand in hers. "Mercy," she said softly, "isn't just my daughter's name. It's a gift we give each other." The morning sun broke through the church's stained glass windows, painting the scene in colors of hope. The congregation sat in peaceful silence, witnessing the moment when their town chose compassion over judgment, understanding over fear. Boone watched from his place in the back, his weathered face soft with emotion. He thought of his own daughter, lost to him years ago, and said a quiet prayer of thanks for the chance to help another father find his way back to grace. Spring sunshine warmed the newly planted garden beds beside the freshly built home for the found and forgotten. The modest building stood proud against the mountainside, its pine boards weathering to a soft silver that matched Boone's cabin in the distance. Yellow crocuses pushed through the melting snow, dotting the path that connected the 2 buildings. Inside the home's main room, Evelyn guided Sarah Mitchell's hands as they worked together at the sewing table. "That's right," she said softly, watching the younger girl's fingers grow more confident with the needle. "Small stitches make the strongest seams." 4 other young women sat nearby, their own work spread across their laps as afternoon light streamed through the windows. Hazel's voice carried from the adjoining room where she conducted her midwifery lessons. "Remember, girls," she instructed, "watching the mother's breathing tells you more than any fancy medical book." Her students, 3 local women, and 1 from the nearby settlement, took careful notes in their journals. The sound of hammering drew Evelyn's attention to the workshop outside. Boone stood surrounded by a group of boys, demonstrating how to shape a piece of pine into a toy horse. His weathered hands moved slowly, making sure each child could follow his movements. 2 finished horses already stood on the workbench, their manes carved with careful detail. "See here," Boone explained, his voice gentle with the orphan boys who gathered every afternoon. "Wood's got its own spirit. You just help it come out." The youngest boy, Tommy, watched with wide eyes as curls of pine fell from Boone's knife. Hoofbeats announced Chief Toma's monthly visit. He rode up leading 2 pack horses laden with dried meat, herbs, and tanned hides. The children ran to greet him, knowing he always brought stories along with supplies. The chief dismounted with dignity, greeting each child by name. "The elk are moving down from summer grounds," he reported to Boone as they unloaded the horses. "Good hunting this season." He paused, looking over the thriving home. Good medicine here too? Different kind of healing? Evelyn emerged from the building carrying 10-month-old Mercy on her hip. The baby had her mother's dark eyes and her father's fair hair, a bridge between worlds that made Chief Toma smile. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small deerskin pouch decorated with beadwork. "For the little one," he said, handing it to Evelyn. "Medicine bag from the grandmothers. They say she carries two people's strength." Evelyn's eyes grew wet as she accepted the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the beadwork reverently. "Will you stay for supper?" Hazel made venison stew. The evening gathered them all around the long table in Boone's cabin, the home's residents, Hazel's students, the orphan boys, and Chief Toma. Lamplight caught the steam rising from bowls of rich stew. Mercy sat in her mother's lap, reaching for pieces of cornbread with determined fingers. After the meal, Evelyn set Mercy down on the plank floor. The baby pulled herself up using the edge of Boone's chair, her small face serious with concentration. Everyone grew quiet, watching. Mercy let go of the chair. For a moment, she stood wobbling, then took one uncertain step forward. Another step followed, shaky but determined. On the third step, her balance wavered. "Oh!" Evelyn moved quickly, catching her daughter before she could fall. Tears sprang to her eyes as she steadied the little girl. "Take my hand now, little one," she said softly, holding out her fingers. Just like that. Boone watched from the doorway, his heart full. The carved nameplate he'd made, Mercy, hung above them on the cabin wall, its letters catching the last rays of sunset through the window. He remembered that snowy morning when he'd found Evelyn alone and afraid in the forest. Now she stood surrounded by family, not of blood, but of choice and compassion. Mercy grabbed her mother's fingers and pulled herself up again, determined to master this new skill. The cabin filled with gentle encouragement and soft laughter as she took another wobbly step. Chief Toma spoke quietly from his place by the fire. "The old ones say every path begins with a single step." He nodded toward mother and child. "This path, it is good medicine for many hearts." Evelyn lifted Mercy into her arms, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. The love in her eyes spoke of healing deeper than words could express, not just for herself, but for everyone gathered in that warm circle of lamplight. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.